there's this kind of notion that the Jews were the ones who were slavishly keeping the law, right? And that the Christians were the ones who were completely abandoning the law of the Old Testament, the Tanakh, right? And so what's interesting is that when you kind of study the Mishnah and the New Testament side by side, you start seeing that it's a more interesting tale than that. Okay,
so, and look, that is the perspective presented by mainstream Christianity, that Paul came and did away with the law, or maybe Jesus did away with the law, depending on your particular theology, and the Jews were the ones who were legalistic, following everything in the law, and they were set free from that by Jesus or by Paul, that depending on your theology, right? That is mainstream Christianity, what they teach. Okay, so you're saying there's more nuance there.
Yeah, because the truth is that when you study the Mishnah, you see, and the fancy word is antinomianism, anti-law. You see these cases where...
Were the Mishnahs antinomian, anti-Torah?
Yeah, and Judaism is going to struggle with that for many, many, many centuries.
So give me an example of that in the Mishnah.
Well, let's take it a little bit slower. I want to read you just a passage in...
I'm the guy who wants to eat dessert first.
Right. So, for example, in Matthew 5:38, we have this idea: you have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. Right? And so on and so forth. So it's the eye for an eye. We're not doing that from the Christian perspective, Old Testament, right? But from the Jewish perspective, it's really interesting because this was one of the major cases. It's in the Mishnah of Bava Kama in chapter 8, where it basically interprets an eye for an eye. No, it's not an eye for an eye. It's money for an eye. It's not tooth for a tooth. It's money for a tooth. It's not bone for a bone. It's money for a bone. And so what the rabbis are doing is they're actually saying that, hey, it's eye for an eye also, from our perspective, needs to be interpreted differently than one would at first see it.
Mm-hmm. So why do you call that antinomian? I wouldn't call that antinomian. Meaning, in other words, you could take it literally, or you could take it metaphorically as referring to some kind of equal compensation, which is how the rabbis take it.
Right, because
I don't consider that antinomian. Antinomian is saying that the Torah is completely done away with, I think. Or I don't know.
Okay.
That's how I take it anyway. But
okay, let's forget the term. Let's scrap the term, right?
Yeah.
But the idea
we're arguing
is
semantics. Okay.
Right. The idea is that the rabbinic Jewish approach to ayin tachat ayin, eye for an eye, shein tachat shein, is that, hey, it's not just it's not literal. It's almost the exact opposite of the literal. By saying eye for an eye, it's being very clear. It's eye for an eye, and in rabbinic Judaism, no, it's something else.
So let's start with this. So there were definitely people in the Second Temple times. Probably there's a group called the Bethusians, the Baitusim, who in one passage, and I think it's in Megillat Ta'anit, it says that they took the Bible kikotva, according to the way it was written. So they interpreted this literally. So Jesus of Nazareth, Yeshua, is saying, you have heard it said that this is to be taken literal. I interpret it this other way. And you're saying the Mishnah has almost the same sermon, except it's a different conclusion, rather than saying it's monetary compensation. He says, you know what, don't even demand compensation at all. And by the way, that phrase, turn the other cheek, a friend of mine, Eitan Birnbaum in Israel, gave this to me. He pointed this out to me. Lamentations 3:30. He giveth his cheek to him that smiteth him. He is filled with reproach. This is talking about how Jerusalem is completely destroyed and humiliated by the enemy invader, the Babylonians. And the phrase there, he gives his cheek to those that smite him. So that was actually a phrase that existed in ancient Israel that Jesus is using in his sermon. And he's saying, you heard eye for an eye means punch out somebody's eye, or maybe even it means force him to pay you. And I say, do what it says in Lamentations, turn the cheek to him.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah.
And for generations, the rabbinic texts are going to struggle with, well, what's going on here? This is impossible. The Torah, it says this, and you're telling me the exact opposite. And so there's a great rabbi, Shimon Bar Yochai, who he had a really great explanation for this. He said that it also says elsewhere in the Bible, Torah achat, one law.
Yeah.
And it wouldn't be fair because let's say there was a person who was blind and then he took out someone's eye.
Mm-hmm.
So the blind person, are you going to take out his eye? It's not fair. He's already lost his eye. So therefore, it has to be talking about money. But this concept is that it needs to be equal for everyone, is that the Torah needs to apply to everyone, is a really radical idea.
Well, and what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai means there is, for a two-eyed person, if you pop out his eye, he loses 50% of his sight. For a one-eyed person, if you pop out his eye, he loses 100% of his sight. So his eye is more valuable to him than the one eye is for the two-eyed person, and that's a good point. And so what Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai does is he takes the extreme case and he tries to say, in this extreme case it doesn't work, and therefore it can't work in the non-extreme case. Of course, in modern law they say you want to not do that. The modern legal approach is you take the minimal case. And you don't take the extremes. The extremes are left for a different situation. You want to define things as narrowly as possible, but whatever. So, but the point is that there's a literal interpretation, and the rabbis don't always follow the literal interpretation. They offer an alternative.
Yeah.
And you're saying in the New Testament they're doing a similar thing, just with a different conclusion.
It kind of like, once you kind of look at both, you're like, well, is it really as the Pharisee, the Prussian, the rabbis are completely following the literal, and when Jesus, like, for example, says that he's the Lord of the Sabbath, and does that mean that he's completely doing away with the Sabbath or not? But
so do you think he did away with the Sabbath?
Well, it seemed there was just a different interpretation, but it's a very interesting, strongly worded interpretation in that passage. So just to end up with another case, which is really interesting, of rabbis kind of going a different path than the law. And what I mean is the Mishnah is a very large corpus of work. It's all about the law, but every once in a while you get these tidbits where it goes against. Is that Hillel the elder instituted something called a prosbul. So you're not allowed to, on every seventh year, the loans are supposed to be undone. All loans are supposed to be undone for the Shemitah year, but that the problem was that people weren't lending each other money, and so Hillel found a way that your loan is not a private loan; it's really a public loan. He found a loophole and basically undid this really powerful biblical law, which said that you can't loan past the Shemitah. People started loaning past the Shemitah. That's essentially what he did. And it's in his own traditional interpretation of how he did it, he was able to do such a thing. But this is very similar to some of the things we were seeing in the New Testament. So it wasn't just, in a vacuum, the Christians were doing this or the Jews were doing this. In this context, people were struggling with biblical texts and coming up with very new ways to interpret them.
Well, I think this is a really important point, because if you were a biblical, if you were a Bethusian, let's start with that, you would look at what Hillel did as he did away with the law of Shemitah. He abolished the law of Shemitah, but from his perspective, he didn't abolish the law of Shemitah. He interpreted it in a way where he created a loophole that allowed him to circumvent what he, viewed as the inconvenient parts. And what Christianity has been accused of is doing away with the Torah. But what you're saying is another way to, at least in some instances, to view it, is they're struggling with, how does this apply in these different circumstances, let's say to Gentiles, right? And so they're looking for ways to apply it in those circumstances from the perspective of the Pharisees. They were doing away with the Torah. Like if you said to an Orthodox Jew, I drive on Shabbat, he'd say, well, you don't keep Shabbat. But from the perspective of a conservative Jew, he'd say, oh, I do keep Shabbat. I keep it 100%. Right. I just don't think that's forbidden on Shabbat. So it's a matter of the New Testament has been kind of read in a sense through these Pharisaical eyes as doing away with Shabbat, and even from Christian eyes to some extent, not even understanding the subtleties of Phariseeism and rabbinical Judaism. And there's a lot more nuance here, is what you're saying.